Look at it. The Twilight Zone it's a place of imagination, a land of shadow. To reach it, you write a dream. To enter it, you need only your imagination.
Most people remember The Twilight Zone for its cosmic twists and cautionary tales, a show that used the supernatural to hold a mirror up to society's darkest corners. But while Rod Serling usually won awards for his social commentary, there was one specific story that went too far. It didn't just push the envelope, it ripped it wide open, causing a backlash so severe that the episode was effectively wiped from television for over 50 years. While the rest of the series became legendary, this one chapter was treated like a crime scene. It was locked away in a vault, hidden from syndication, and scrubbed from marathons as if it never existed. It wasn't a monster or an alien that scared the critics. It was something far more grounded and far more dangerous. So, what exactly was this episode that seemed too risky for the airwaves? And what happened within those 30 minutes that forced the network to bury it for half a century? Join us as we get into all the details. The man who outsmarted the censors. When you think of the greatest television ever made, one name always rises to the top: The Twilight Zone. It first hit the airwaves on October 2nd, 1959, and for 5 years, it took viewers on a journey into a dimension that was as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. Created by the legendary Rod Serling, this wasn't just another show. It was a weekly anthology of the strange, the supernatural, and the terrifying. Every episode was a standalone story, meaning you never knew if you were going to see a futuristic city, a haunted attic, or a quiet suburban street that was about to turn into a nightmare. But while the fans loved the aliens and the twist endings, the real story behind the show started with a man who was tired of being told what to do. Before he became our guide through the fifth dimension, Rod Serling was a superstar writer who was constantly fighting with network executives. Back then, sponsors had total control over what aired. If a company sold lighters, you couldn't have a character use a match. If a car company sponsored the show, they'd actually demand that the buildings of their competitors be scrubbed out of the background. For a serious writer like Serling, who wanted to talk about real human problems, this was a total disaster. The breaking point came when Serling tried to write a story about a real-life tragedy involving racial injustice. By the time the networks and sponsors got through with it, they had changed the setting and the characters so much that the original message was completely erased. That's when Serling realized something brilliant. If he wanted to talk about the darkness in the real world, he had to hide it in a world that didn't exist. He figured out that censors didn't mind a story about prejudice or war if it was happening to a green-skinned alien on a different planet. This led to his 1957 pitch called The Time Element, a story about a man who travels back to 1941 to warn people about Pearl Harbor. The network originally threw it in a vault, but when it finally aired, the response was so massive that they had no choice but to give Serling his own show. From that point on, The Twilight Zone became a playground for his imagination. He served as the executive producer, the head writer, and the iconic narrator who stepped onto the screen to tell us exactly how and why his characters had lost their way. The show also became a launching pad for some of the biggest stars in history. Long before they were household names, actors like Robert Redford, William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and even a young Ron Howard were appearing in these 30-minute moral puzzles. They played characters caught in the cruel indifference of fate, often facing a surprise ending that forced them and the audience to look at themselves in a whole new way. By the time the series ended in 1964, Serling had written nearly 100 episodes, covering everything from greed and jealousy to the mysteries of the human mind. He proved that you don't need a massive budget or a realistic setting to tell a powerful truth. You just need a good story and a trip into that middle ground between light and shadow. Today, we're still looking for that signpost up ahead. Because the Twilight Zone showed us that the most frightening monsters aren't hiding under the bed. They're the ones we carry inside ourselves. The life of Rod Serling. To understand the man behind the mystery, you have to go back to Christmas Day, 1924. Rodman Edward Serling was born in Syracuse, New York, but he grew up in the quiet town of Binghamton, where his father ran a local grocery store. It was a normal, peaceful childhood, but as soon as he finished high school, the world changed. Serling enlisted in the Army during World War II, fueled by a burning desire to help defeat the Nazis in Europe. However, fate had a different plan, and he was sent to the Pacific as a paratrooper instead. The war didn't just leave him with a Purple Heart. It left him with deep emotional scars that never truly healed. He saw the worst of humanity at the Battle of Leyte, and when he finally came home with injuries to his knee and wrist, he found a different kind of pain waiting for him. His father died suddenly of a heart attack shortly after his return. This double blow of wartime trauma and personal loss became the fuel for his creative fire. Every ghost, every monster, and every broken character he would later write was born from the shadows of his own experiences. After the war, Serling moved to Ohio to attend Antioch College. It was here that he met his wife, Carol, and started the family that would become his anchor. Even as his career exploded and he began working grueling 12-hour days, 7 days a week, he remained a devoted father. His daughter Anne later shared that she never even felt the weight of his long work hours. To her, he was just a dad who was always there if she needed to talk. He was a man who lived in the twilight zone of his imagination, but kept his feet firmly planted in the love of his family. Sadly, the relentless pace of his life and the stress he carried eventually caught up with him. In May 1975, at just 50 years old, Serling suffered a heart attack while running on a treadmill. Only a few weeks later, a second attack hit him while he was relaxing at his cottage by the lake. He was rushed into open-heart surgery, but on June 28, 1975, the man who had spent his life exploring the mysteries of death and the human soul finally stepped behind the curtain for good. He left behind a legacy that continues to haunt us, but the road to making that legacy wasn't exactly a smooth ride. In fact, the show that made him a household name was a constant battleground between his creative vision and the suits in charge. The 30-minute masterpiece the networks tried to kill. It's a shock to most people today, but the show we now call a masterpiece wasn't always a winner. Even though critics loved it, The Twilight Zone struggled to find its footing with the big bosses at CBS. Believe it or not, the show was actually canceled twice. The first time was after the third season, mostly because they couldn't find a sponsor willing to attach their name to such weird stories. It also didn't help that a high-ranking executive named James Aubrey reportedly couldn't stand the series. He replaced it with a comedy called Fair Exchange, but that show flopped so hard that the network crawled back to Serling, begging for more. But this comeback came with a catch that almost broke the show's spirit. For the first 3 seasons, the episodes were a perfect, punchy 30 minutes. When it returned for season 4, the network forced it into a full-hour format. This was a nightmare for Serling. He was already exhausted from writing the bulk of the series himself, and stretching those tight, twisty plots into 60 minutes made the stories feel thin. By the time they switched back to the half-hour format for season 5, the magic had faded, the audience had drifted away, and the network pulled the plug for good. While the show felt like pure fantasy, its soul was built on a very real, very dark tragedy. Rod Serling was deeply haunted by the 1955 murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy who was brutally killed in Mississippi. Serling was desperate to write a serious drama about the case, but every time he tried, the networks shut him down. They were terrified of the controversy. This frustration is exactly why the Twilight Zone exists. Serling realized that if he wanted to talk about the ugliness of racism and hate, he had to disguise it. He famously said that a writer must use their art as a vehicle of social criticism. And by using aliens and monsters as a cover, he finally found a way to show America its own reflection without the censors stopping him. To the public, Rod Serling was this intense, mysterious figure in a dark suit, but his family knew a completely different man. His daughter, Anne, once shared that the black and white image everyone had of him couldn't have been further from the truth. In reality, he was a total goofball and a legendary practical joker. He was the guy at parties who would put a lampshade on his head just to get a laugh. It sounds like a contradiction, but it makes perfect sense. A man who spent so much time staring into the abyss of human cruelty probably needed humor just to stay sane. He had a huge heart, too. When an actor named Paul Douglas died right after filming an episode, Serling paid out of his own pocket to reshoot the scenes with a new actor because he felt the original footage didn't do the story justice. Then there's that iconic music. You know the one. Those 4 haunting notes that instantly tell you you've stepped into another dimension. Interestingly, that theme wasn't there at the start. The original music was actually written by Bernard Herrmann, the genius behind the scores for Psycho and Vertigo. It was great, but the suits at the network weren't satisfied. They went on a frantic search for something new, even asking other legendary composers to give it a shot. The way they finally found the perfect sound was actually a bit of a sneaky business move. The CBS music director, Lud Gluskin, wanted to save money and avoid union fees, so he went looking for cheap music from Europe. He found some musical cues written by a struggling Romanian composer named Marius Constant. Constant was offered a measly $200 to write something by the next day, with a small bonus if they used it. He turned in his work, got paid, and had no idea his music was being used for one of the most famous shows in history until months later. It was a Frankenstein theme, stitched together from different pieces of music, but it became an immortal part of pop culture. Constant didn't even get credit for his work until the 1980s. He eventually had to sue just to get recognized, proving that even behind the scenes, the Twilight Zone was full of strange twists and turns. From its humble, struggling beginnings to its status as a cultural giant, the show's journey was just as dramatic as the stories Serling told. It was a perfect storm of a man's personal trauma, his fight against censorship, and a little bit of accidental musical genius, all coming together to create a world where the impossible was always just one step away. But as much as Serling relied on his own imagination, sometimes the most incredible stories weren't written in a Hollywood office. They were discovered elsewhere. By the time the show was nearing its end, the team had to get creative not just with their scripts, but with their wallets too, leading to one of the most unique episodes in TV history. The $25,000 masterpiece, the short film that saved the zone. The Season 5 episode, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, is a piece of television history that almost feels like it was pulled from another world. Long before it graced American TV screens, this story had already conquered the global stage, winning the Oscar for Best Live-Action Short Film and taking home top honors at the 1962 Cannes Film Festival. So, how did such a high-class, prestigious French film end up tucked into a weekly sci-fi anthology like The Twilight Zone? The answer is a lot less mystical and a lot more practical. It all came down to cold, hard cash. By the time the show reached its 5th season, the producers were drowning. They were trying to stretch their shrinking budget across a massive order of 36 episodes. Usually, it cost about $65,000 to produce a single episode from scratch. Producer William Frew realized he could save a fortune by simply buying the rights to air this existing short film for a measly $25,000. It had to be trimmed a bit to fit the commercial breaks, but saving $40,000 was a deal he couldn't pass up. But it wasn't just about the money, it was about the vibe. On paper, an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge doesn't look like your typical Twilight Zone episode. Set in 1862, it tells the story of a Confederate sympathizer who miraculously escapes his own execution to reunite with his family. There aren't any space travelers or ironic genies, but its eerie tone and the feeling that something is fundamentally off made it fit perfectly into Rod Serling's universe. It explored those dark, dusty corners of the human mind where reality and hallucination blur, making it one of the most haunting and memorable chapters in the series. Of course, you can't talk about the show without talking about the man himself, Rod Serling. To us, he is the show. He was the brain that dreamed it up, the pen that wrote most of the scripts, and the voice that guided us through the dark every week. But interestingly, Serling was never meant to be the narrator. In the early days, he was only known as a writer. The producers actually wanted a professional voice actor named Cornelius Westbrook Van Voorhis. This guy was a legend in the 1940s, nicknamed the Voice of Doom, because he narrated all the heavy-hitting newsreels. They tried him out for the pilot, Where Is Everybody? But it just didn't click. His voice was so polished and deep that it came off as pretentious and a bit too stiff for a show about imagination. They even considered the great Orson Welles, but he wanted a mountain of money that the studio wasn't willing to pay. Eventually, Serling just threw his own hat in the ring and volunteered. It turned out to be the smartest move in TV history. There's even a funny story from the early recording sessions where Serling kept talking about the sixth dimension. He had to change it to the fifth because he and the producers realized they couldn't even explain what the fifth one was, let alone the sixth. Once he established himself as the host, Serling basically became a god within the show's universe. He was everywhere and nowhere, watching the strange events unfold, but never lifting a finger to help. But his godlike power didn't stop on the screen. It followed him behind the scenes, too. There was this bizarre, unofficial rule at CBS that only Rod Serling was allowed to use the word God in his scripts. Richard Matheson, another legendary writer for the show, used to get incredibly frustrated by this. He'd try to write the word into his scripts, and the network censors would cross it out immediately. He never quite understood why, but he figured Serling's reputation was just so solid that the suits gave him a pass that no one else could get. It took a lot of trial and error to get to that level of power, though. Serling actually had to write 3 different pilots before the show was finally born. His first attempt, The Time Element, was a time travel story about Pearl Harbor that the network originally hated and threw into a vault. It only got made because another producer discovered it and turned it into a massive hit on a different program. After that success, the network asked Serling for another pilot. He turned in a script called The Happy Place, which was a terrifying look at a future where people over 60 were executed. The producers loved the quality of the writing, but they found it way too depressing and bleak to launch a brand new series. So, Serling went back to the typewriter one more time. The third try was the charm. He came up with Where Is Everybody? A suspenseful mystery that perfectly balanced intrigue and psychological dread without needing aliens or monsters. It set the tone for everything that was to come, proving that sometimes the most dangerous place you can visit isn't another planet, but the lonely world inside your own head. But while Serling was busy exploring the human mind, other creators on the show were busy dealing with a different kind of nightmare. Sometimes, the drama on the set was just as intense as the scripts themselves. And for one specific episode, the tension didn't stay behind the scenes. It exploded into a full-on controversy that lasted for decades. Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. Richard Donner's personal hell. George Takei is a name we all associate with the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, but before he was boldly going where no man has gone before, he was navigating the much darker corridors of the Twilight Zone. In an episode titled The Encounter, a young Takei played a Japanese-American gardener who gets into a tense psychological standoff with a World War II veteran. It starts as a simple conversation, but as the two men talk, a cursed samurai sword acts as a supernatural catalyst, stripping away their masks and revealing the ugly scars of their pasts. While many consider it one of the show's most profound statements on how war destroys the human spirit, it also holds a much more controversial record. Following its initial airing, the backlash was so swift and so severe that CBS did something almost unheard of. They pulled the episode from the rotation and locked it away. Japanese-American advocacy groups were deeply offended by how the episode portrayed their culture and history, especially with plot points that felt like a slap in the face to those who had lived through the trauma of internment. Because of this, The Encounter became a lost chapter. In an interview, Takei himself joked that it was the only episode to never enjoy a rerun, which meant he spent decades missing out on those sweet residual checks. It wasn't until 2016 that it finally resurfaced during a New Year's Day marathon, over 50 years after it was first buried. It stands today as a fascinating, if uncomfortable, reminder of a time when the show's social commentary hit a nerve that was just too raw for the public to handle. Speaking of mysteries, even the origin of the show's legendary title is wrapped in a bit of an enigma. You'd think the man who created the fifth dimension would know exactly where the name came from. But Rod Serling was never entirely sure. He initially believed he had simply made the phrase up out of thin air. But later on, he realized he might have been tapping into his own military past. It turns out that Twilight Zone was actually an obscure Air Force term used by pilots. It describes that disorienting moment when a plane is coming in for an approach and the pilot can no longer see the horizon. A literal state of being caught between two worlds. Since Serling had served in the military before he ever touched a typewriter, it's highly likely the term was just floating around in the back of his mind, waiting for the right moment to surface. But the Air Force wasn't the only place the phrase popped up. As far back as 1946, philosophers were using the term to describe that twilight zone of creativeness, where art and science meet. It's almost poetically fitting that a name so synonymous with the unknown has such an elusive history itself. It was a term that existed in the shadows long before Serling used it to change the face of television. But while the name might have come easily, some of the most famous episodes were a total nightmare to film. Take Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, for example. This is the one everyone remembers. The legendary story of a man on a flight, played by a pre-Star Trek William Shatner, who sees a bizarre creature tearing apart the engine on the wing of the plane. On screen, it's a masterclass in suspense, but behind the scenes, director Richard Donner was living through his own personal version of hell. Even though Donner would go on to direct massive hits like Superman and Lethal Weapon, nothing could have prepared him for the chaos of that set. The technical requirements were staggering for the time. They had to coordinate a man flying in on wires, massive wind machines, fake rain, lightning, and smoke to create the illusion of a storm at high altitude. The noise from the machines was so deafening that the actors couldn't even hear their own voices, let alone the director's instructions. Donner later described the experience as unbearable, noting that they were fighting against the clock every single second. If one wire snapped or one smoke machine jammed, the entire take was ruined. It was a high-stakes, high-stress production that pushed everyone to their limit. Despite the goofy-looking creature suit that fans poke fun at today, the sheer tension they captured in that cramped cockpit became one of the most iconic moments in pop culture history. It's a perfect example of how, in the world of Rod Serling, the struggle to create the impossible often resulted in something truly timeless. But while most of the show's battles were fought against wind machines and tight budgets, one specific story sparked a war with the public that lasted for half a century. Even for a show that loved to push buttons, this episode went a step too far, leading to a decades-long blackout that nobody saw coming. Why the encounter vanished. The Twilight Zone was famous for its eerie twists, but one episode stood out for all the wrong reasons. While classics like The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street are still praised today, an episode titled The Encounter became a ghost in the show's history, yanked from the airwaves for a staggering 52 years. It wasn't a monster or an alien that caused the blackout. It was a story that hit a nerve far too raw for the American public. The plot traps two men in a cluttered attic: Fenton, a weary World War II veteran, and Arthur Takamori, played by a young George Takei, who shows up looking for work. What starts as a simple conversation quickly turns toxic. At the center of the room sits a captured samurai sword, a trophy Fenton took from a soldier he killed. The story implies the sword holds a supernatural malice, acting like a pressure cooker that forces both men to confront their darkest wartime traumas. But the real reason it was banned wasn't the violence. It was the message. The episode suggested that Arthur's father had been a traitor during the Pearl Harbor attacks. Not only was this historically inaccurate, but it was incredibly offensive to the Japanese-American community who had suffered through the tragedy of internment camps. Coming out just as the U.S. was entering the Vietnam War, the timing couldn't have been worse. CBS effectively buried the episode, and it didn't resurface until a New Year's Day marathon in 2016. Sadly, this wasn't the only shadow over the franchise. Years later, in 1982, The Twilight Zone. The movie became the site of one of Hollywood's worst tragedies. A helicopter crash on set claimed the lives of actor Vic Morrow and two child actors, a disaster so horrific it changed movie safety laws forever. It's a reminder that even the most boundary-pushing shows can go too far. From Seinfeld pulling the Puerto Rican Day episode to The Simpsons hiding their New York City special after 9/11, TV history is full of moments where the line between bold and problematic gets blurred. The Encounter remains a haunting reminder that in the zone, the real-world consequences are often scarier than the fiction. What Twilight Zone episode is your favorite to this very day? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.